Welcome to another episode of the How to Do Your 20s podcast. And in this episode, we're talking all about brain improvement, how to improve your reading speed a little bit, mostly how to improve memorization techniques, motivation, and all kinds of really cool things. And I'm here with Tony, and he just recently wrote a great book all about brain improvement. And I'm going to let you get into that. But first, why don't you tell us a little bit about your backstory and how you got involved with this?
Sure. Thanks, Travis, for having me on the show. Well, I sort of the whole story that precludes my writing of the book began when I was born. Really, I was born into a bilingual family here in Helsinki, Finland. You can see some of the view here from my window, and I grew up speaking Finnish and Russian at home. Started taking English around third grade. Did really well in school. I had and still do have a grandma who tutored me in physics and math. I ended up graduating from junior high with the perfect GPA, then went on to a top high school here in Helsinki, and sort of got interested in other things. Once I got to high school, I realized that maybe studying all this time wasn't really worth it for whatever reason. Still graduated with good grades. I won a scholarship to study in the US at Vanderbilt University, where after a couple of semesters, I went to Columbia. And really, the book got started when in college, I sort of noticed very common patterns between many of my peers and many of the other students in the class, where for a lot of people in their mid-teens, they dropped their whatever after-school activity they were pursuing. For me, that was competitive swimming. And then they'd sort of replace it with some kind of mind-numbing activity, if you will, video games, MSN Messenger. A lot of times they'd also drop their reading habit, maybe start procrastinating on their homework. And then those problems would sort of compound into college, where a lot of times people would mess up their sleeping schedule, they'd mess up their diets because you're in college and partying and eating a lot of crap. And obviously that's part of life, but for most people, those were not conscious choices. And I sort of wrote the book to elucidate and show how you can reverse those bad choices that you've made and actually go far above of like what your natural maximum cognitive potential could be.
So let's jump right into it. What are some of the top action items that people can do to improve their brain performance?
Sure. Well, if you think about cognitive enhancement, it has sort of like a pyramid that's a hierarchy or like a hierarchical structure in it, where at the bottom you have all the basics and the fundamentals, the ones that you've probably heard from your grandma. It says, you have to sleep well, get adequate nutrition, do your proper physical exercise. A lot of times, especially now, people are very hooked onto their smartphones. So if you're, say, a software engineer, you're a computer programmer, and you're hacking away at code, but then you're constantly being interrupted by little notifications and blips on your phone, you're not really getting the full benefit of focusing on one thing at a time. So if you want to boost your brain power, you'd really begin looking at the core things, looking at how you're sleeping and so forth. Maybe get rid of all the notifications so that you work in longer periods of time that are uninterrupted. And then after that, what I recommend is you get a blood test done. Basically, you get a blood test from, I recommend a nonprofit in Florida. It's called the Life Extension Foundation. And they publish a lot of anti-aging research, and they sell a lot of nutritional supplements that counter the effects of aging. In any case, you get a full panel done, which measures levels of micronutrients, hormones that allow you to see whether you're deficient in some of them. And so if you're deficient in, say, magnesium or vitamin D3, those are relatively easy to fix. You just sort of get like a very cheap supplement from your local CVS. You take that, and then a couple of months later, your levels will have probably restored themselves to a proper level. But then if you have, say, testosterone deficiency and you're a guy in your mid-20s, that can be a lot more difficult to figure out the reason for. So in that case, you'd probably want to work with your physician, because testosterone, although we perceive it as sort of like the male hormone and like it makes us all brawny and strong and aggressive, it actually has a lot of cognitive effects as well, and it impacts very strongly your perceived well-being, how you feel during the day, do you get tired at work. And then, once you've sort of fixed up those, if you're taking certain nutritional supplements to boost your cognition, Then you can again move up that little ladder
So really
and then
quick,
start off.
how much does
Sure.
it cost for the blood panel, and how does it work? Do you send, if it's in Florida, I'm hoping I don't have to fly all the way out there. How does that
No,
process
I
work?
think you can get that done in your local city. They usually have certified technicians in your city where you just drive in, have your blood drawn, and it takes about 20 minutes, and then they ship those blood samples down to Florida, where I think they analyze some of them just on the spot, and then you get an email giving like a full total or like a full breakdown of whatever it is that you need to do.
Mhm.
But going back to that, you would probably, after fixing all the micronutrient deficiencies and everything else, you'd start looking at the milder cognitive enhancers or what are known as smart drugs. So you could start using something like theanine, which is an amino acid that has a very calming effect on your mind, allows you to focus. Same thing with caffeine. From there you could probably move on to something like piracetam, which is very commonly used. It's been around since the 60s or the 70s, I think, and it's one of the best researched substances there are. And then, at the top of that ladder is pharmaceutical grade medication, things like Adderall, modafinal, Ritalin. I tend to be categorically opposed to some of them just because I don't think they're good for you long term.
Mhm.
But for a lot of people, when they think of cognitive enhancement, they always think of like, oh, what are the pills? What are the pills that I can pop today that will make me amazing? And certainly a lot of those can help. They're very, very effective, but they do come with a host of different side effects that are probably undesirable long term. So for most people, it can be even disappointing to hear that, oh, you need to fix your fundamentals first, then move on to the micronutrients, and then finally, if you want to and you've done your research, move on to the medication. But that's the way that I go about it, and I find that's the safest way as well.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Yeah, I mean, you can tell the difference when you sleep a good night's sleep and you're eating healthy and you're exercising. You just are more on point in everything. And I do agree with you. A lot of people want that quick fix. And I've taken Adderall before. I've taken modafinil once, or I don't know how you pronounce it properly, but
Right,
I Adderall is great, but I do not think it's good for
right,
you long term. There's no way. Just the way you feel is
right.
like this should not be taken every day. Same thing with the
Yeah,
modafinil. In my opinion, I actually ended up getting, I don't know if it was like a migraine, but like at a certain point, as I was starting to work, my brain was just like, you need to stop. Like my brain was painful, which is not something you ever
right.
want, you know?
You can certainly get headaches. In the case of Adderall, the reason that I'm concerned about that is just the relaxation of the diagnostic criteria for ADHD in the US. I looked at the diagnostic criteria myself. I don't have ADHD, but I could have it.
Mm,
Potentially, if I wanted to walk to the doctor's office and complain of all these symptoms, well, I can't focus on my homework. I can't finish reading a page without wandering off. Certain days I can,
hmm.
but that doesn't mean that I have ADHD. But if I wanted to get diagnosed and get Adderall for myself, I could probably do that. In addition to that, ADHD sort of tends to be habituating and tolerance building, which means that you sort of end up upping your dose over time, which I don't think is a good thing for you long term.
Yeah, I was definitely, if nothing else, psychologically addicted. I would only do work well on it. And then for a long time afterwards, I was scared that I would not be able to work without it because I got so used to getting so much done in a short period of time that when I went to, oh, I got to do this, and it's fun. To be honest with you, when you're on Adderall and you're working, you enjoy it more. And now it's like
Right,
I have to relearn, hey, it's not always supposed to be a blast, like while you're doing your work.
right,
The next thing I kind of want to talk about is memorization techniques. And I know that you have a couple different interesting memorization techniques, and this is a space that I'm
sure.
really interested in learning more about. So, what are some of the best memorization techniques you have?
Well, memorization techniques are they can be perceived as intimidating. You hear of all these memorization championships where people memorize decks of cards or digits of pi, and it's all very nerdy and wacky. But the easiest memorization techniques don't really even deserve the name of a technique. Where for especially a lot of students, I'm on an extended leave of absence from my school. A lot of the students that I studied with would sort of just study in these very long stretches of time and what I call passively, where they go to lectures, they listen to the teacher, they read their textbooks, read their notes, and then maybe watch some Khan Academy video explanations. But it's kind of like the equivalent of head nodding, where if someone's explaining something really difficult to you, it all makes sense unless or until the moment where you're removed from that situation, you actually have to make use of the information that you were given. So if you think about an exam situation, basically you walk in, you're given a paper, it has a bunch of questions on it, you're being tested on your ability to retrieve information from your own mind. And if there's some kind of essays or something, you probably would want to also know how to analyze that information or apply it in a certain way. So if you want to get really good at that, if you want to get really good at retrieving information from your own head, then you should probably practice that ahead of time. And there's an active branch of learning that's called active recall, which just means that flashcards are a very common form of this, or solving problems, or in the case of if you're reviewing for a more concept-driven exam or subject matter, you would test yourself on whatever definitions and concepts that you don't understand by trying to lecture to an imaginary audience or an imaginary friend. So say you're trying to, you have an exam coming up on 18th century American history, you would pore over some of the books, jot down in notes what are the key concepts, and then ask yourself, like, what could be a potential essay question in an exam like this? And then you would regurgitate those and then explain details. That allows you to basically understand what it is that you don't know and also weed out any of the inconsistencies in the understanding that you do have. And then moving further from that, you could use something called the memory palace, which is something that's very popular. It's been around since ancient Roman times, and it was even back then used for memorizing long speeches, where basically you'd envision in your own mind your childhood home, the first school you went to, some location that you know very well that you can navigate around in your head. And then you would deposit certain items in certain rooms. So if you lived in a townhouse when you were a kid, you'd have two to three stories. You deposit whatever it is, like whatever the main points in your speech or whatever it is that you're memorizing, your set of items. You deposit those little items into all of the rooms and then walk through all the rooms in a certain order, which would allow you then to recall those items at that particular moment when you need them. And the reason that it's really, really effective is that it sort of commits it to your visual and spatial memory rather than you remembering it in your linguistic one, your verbal one.
Do you use this technique?
Well, as you sort of get more advanced, you start looking at memorization techniques in conjunction with each other. So I certainly use the memory palace. There's also two more advanced ones that are called chaining and pegging, which are really handy for memorizing really, really long sets of items, or what I have used it for is memorizing sort of like I've constructed these imaginary, like streets and little blocks where each house represents like a chapter in a certain textbook, and then each of the rooms represents a section in that room, and then you walk around and then you sort of visualize whatever are the key equations or the key concepts. You visualize those in your head, and then actually recalling them is kind of easy because they're just objects in your head instead of them being something that you don't understand.
So the memory palace is something I've been really interested in. I've tried to use, but one of the problems I run into, let's say I wanted to use my childhood house.
Right,
I've always thought of it as, each room has its own thing, but my house only has, let's say, 10 rooms. And
right,
then I'm kind of limited to only memorizing 10 things, where, like, let's say I'm trying to memorize a deck of cards. That's a common one. I always
right,
thought, like, I don't know of a place that has 52 rooms, which makes it kind of tough.
right.
And then the other
But then
go ahead.
you can allow it to branch down. If you're, say, memorizing a deck of cards, you can store 5 cards per room. If you still remember the furniture, maybe some of the cards are underneath the table or on the table or on the wall or hanging from the ceiling. So it doesn't necessarily need to be restricted with one item per room. You can certainly add more.
Okay, and then would you just one of the things I was thinking about potentially is like each corner of the room or something like that has a number.
Right. Well, the problem is you'd want to know. instinctively what the order is that you go through the items.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in the case of, well, if you're memorizing say you're trying to memorize a grocery list, the ordering doesn't really matter. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter if you first get eggs and meats if you're getting them from the same store. If you're memorizing a deck of cards, it's tremendously important for you to know the ordering. So you would know, you would somehow need to establish like a set path,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe like an easy, convenient way for you to go between the rooms. And then once you get to each room, figure out what are the first items in the list.
Mm-hmm.
So you could arrange them in a particular way in that room. That's certainly a possibility.
I'm definitely. This is one of those things that I really want to spend.
Or you can
Yeah.
or you can get creative with it. You can create like a cupboard in that particular room, and then from top to bottom you have the cards sort of and stack them on top of each other.
That's good too. Yeah, I really want to spend a week and just focus on this because I've done it before. I used to live in a fraternity house and I tried it with all the different rooms. The problem was, and there was about 20 rooms there, so it was perfect and they were numbered.
Right.
The problem was I never took it seriously enough to really commit it to memory. And like over time, I kind of like, well, there's certain rooms that didn't have numbers, and I'm like, would that be, number 11 or should that be number 21 and whatever. But
Right.
I think a good way, like you said, is to use the childhood house because I'm never going to forget what this looks like. I just got to figure out
Right.
what corners or what numbers and all that kind of stuff.
Right. And then, depending on whether or not the ordering matters, that's going to dictate very strongly how you're going to make use of that memorization technique.
Yeah. And you said there's two other memorization techniques that you use, pegging, and I don't remember the
Right.
other one.
Chaining.
Chaining. Okay.
Chaining and pegging. Pegging is more complicated than chaining. It really comes into use when you're memorizing items that are sort of like 0 to 1,000, 0 to 500.
Mm.
It can be somewhat difficult to explain for someone. I mean, it's easy to explain, but it's difficult for someone to grasp it just by getting the explanation. You have to really start using it to get it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just based on where if you're storing certain things in rooms, whatever item it is that you're storing, it would represent a word. So if you're listing like a certain set of items, you would convert all of those items into numbers based on a certain set of phonetic rules where each digit represents a certain letter or sound. But that can be difficult to manage and especially to learn at the beginning. Those are the ones that have sort of like the highest initial setup cost. They're highly effective, but you're going to take a couple hours, you're going to take a couple of days and weeks to like really, really learn them and start using them effectively in your day-to-day life. And it really comes into handy only when you're memorizing massive, massive items.
And you sent me a message talking about the Feynman technique and active recall. So is this first
Right.
part active recall or is that something
Well,
different?
active recall, sure. So active recall is just the active retrieval of information. So
Okay.
you could, uh, whatever prompt you're given, say that's an equation that you need to solve, or maybe it's some kind of definition for a word that you need to recall. You can do that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you fully understand whatever it is that you're doing. So the Feynman technique is just refers to the active explanation of something to an imaginary audience. So Richard Feynman, who I don't know if you're familiar with, was this just great physicist, and he fell very strongly in love with Brazilian culture, and then taught physics there. But he found that even though the students performed really, really well on the exams, they had a very poor understanding of the physics behind their course material, which was partly due to people just memorizing stuff and then not really truly, truly understanding it. And he always said that what I cannot create, I do not understand. So if you cannot explain something from the very bottom, you probably don't understand it. And if you're trying to explain it, it allows you to figure out what it is that you don't know, which is very valuable when you're preparing for an exam. It's very difficult, but it allows you to perform a lot better than most students.
Another technique that I've used before with pretty good success, and I don't know if this kind of comes in with pegging, is just creating pictures out of whatever. Let's say, for instance, I had a neuroscience exam in college that I really used this for, where I needed to know, what sodium did in the brain, kind of thing, and I just would create a picture of a girl like holding salts and doing something that reminded me of the actions
Right.
within the brain. Is that pegging or?
Well, it's not really pegging. It's called you're sort of just visualizing. In psychology, that's called the von Restarff effect,
Okay.
where the more ridiculous
Yeah.
or sort of outrageous the whatever little mnemonic rule that you came up with is, the more memorable it is. And the one that you're doing, that's just sort of visual representation of an idea or a concept.
Yeah, that worked out really well for me, and I really like the crazier you can make the picture, the more likely you are to memorize it, which I found to be
Right,
very, very much true.
right.
The next topic I kind of want to talk about is increasing motivation and how to improve motivation, which is something that I think a lot of people, including myself, struggle with. It's, everyone has these great ideas of everything they want to get done in a day, but then 2 hours into it,
Right.
it's like, ugh, I don't want to do this anymore. How do you recommend improving motivation?
Well, I go about it in a not necessarily scientific way, but in a little more technical way, where I just looked at some of the neuroscience or college level, nothing very professional, but I figured out that dopamine plays a very role. If you've taken neuroscience, you'll know that dopamine plays a huge role in the areas that govern learning, attention, motivation. For a long time, neuroscientists used to think that dopamine sort of just was released upon reward, but it's actually tied a lot more to the anticipation of reward, and its levels fall once the reward has been received. And you can't really pinpoint its function to one specific task. It's involved with a multitude of receptors and a multitude of areas. But what I find is that a lot of the things that we do in modern days tend to downregulate our dopamine receptors. And when that happens sort of chronically, the whatever level of dopamine that passes through your dopamine receptors doesn't trigger that action in you. And that can be due to a variety of factors. I sort of bring up video gaming in my book as one of the things. Also, just generally things that really hike up dopamine levels. If you log into your Facebook a lot of times, that can certainly lead to a poor attention span. Your willpower can decrease over the day. And there's certain remedies that you can do or not really take, but there are activities that can counteract that effect. And I recommend cold showers or fasting. Those things have, at least in rodents, shown to increase dopamine receptor density and probably increase it as well
So with the cold
in
showers,
humans.
how do you do the like? So I actually do a cold shower every morning and every night, but I start with a warm shower
Right.
because to
Right.
me the idea of you wake up and you got to jump in a cold shower is just too awful. So it's at least it's like, all right,
Yeah.
warm up the body and then kind of step away, turn it cold, and then jump in. And I still find that
Yeah.
I get a lot of the benefits. How do you do the cold
Oh yeah,
shower?
that's fine.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I do the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's not really a lot of downsides to it. But just going back to the idea of like us being overstimulated by certain activities in our environment, the way we sort of think of our minds is we think that the stream of consciousness that we receive is all there is to it. That whatever it is that you're thinking, that tends to be whatever it is, or that tends to be everything that there is going on in your head. And that's not true, because a lot of the autonomous functions like breathing, temperature, hunger, or semi-autonomous functions like heartbeat, those tend to be regulated by the reptilian complex, which is at the base of our brains. And it's also responsible for us doing dumb things like salivating when we see a burger on a banner driving down the highway, or us, like gawking when we see that pretty girl on Instagram and like click further. So a lot of the things that we do sort of they not they misalign the reptilian brain from the higher order brain, where you can logically be fully aware that you need to be doing homework, you need to be working on your thing, you need to be going to the gym, whatever it is. But then the sort of reptilian brain, if you think of it as a different identity, as a different mind, it's saying, no, just stay here, eat the fatty food, whatever it is that's not conducive to your long-term goal, and you know it. And overcoming that can be very difficult. And a lot of the things that we do, a lot of our behavior is very much on autopilot.
So how do you get those different brains aligned?
Well, it can be certainly very difficult. I can't think of any research that has talked about that.
Hmm.
I do know that if you look at, say, exercising, doing that as a habit where you're not every time making the conscious decision to go to the gym,
Yeah.
you're sort of like intelligently manipulating yourself into getting into the habit of going to the gym where you don't have to command yourself every time. I know I exercise fairly regularly. I remember when I started out, first I think, oh, I don't really want to go. This sucks. And after a while, it was like, it's okay. Now I look forward to it. So it's just something that my body has adapted to, and it's not a conscious choice. So it's kind of like you're sort of like tricking yourself into it. You say to yourself, I'm only going to do this for X number of days, whatever number of days it is takes to form habit.
Hmm.
And then after that, you're going to stop. So, and there's other, little tricks and tips that you can use to sort of steer yourself away from undesirable activities towards ones that you do desire and you find conducive to your long-term goals.
Yeah, two things that I'd like to add is one that I find making the goals as small as possible at first really helps. For instance, with the gym thing, if your goal is to go to the gym every day and work out for an hour, and in the past you never worked out before, yeah, good luck with that. Like I'll put money
Yeah,
on
you're
you're gonna fail. I mean,
right,
if your goal on the other hand is, 3 days a week to go to the gym for 20 minutes or, just something extremely, like I even tell people, if you've never gone to the gym before, maybe your goal should just be to go to the gym for 3 days. If you touch a treadmill
right,
and leave, good for you. Then, in a week or two, maybe your goal is 20 minutes on the treadmill. And I find that, for me personally, I was really resistant against this idea for a long time, but I recently started incorporating it, and it works because I'm like, okay, I'm going to meditate 5 minutes every morning. And it's hard for me to justify not just spending that 5 minutes. But if I were to say, I want to
right.
meditate 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes at night, as soon as I fail, it's like, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore.
Yeah. Same thing actually applies to getting out of bed without hitting the snooze button.
Yeah.
If you do it, you can do that. There's certain blogs that I've read about people uh, just getting into bed, turning off the lights, taking their clothes off, then sort of setting their alarm for 5-minute intervals, and then over an hour you'd get up whatever number of times, and then the following morning you're going to automatically just on autopilot as a cue. After the cue, you're going to get up. I'm certainly guilty of not doing that myself yet. I tend to hit the snooze once or twice, but that's something I'm going to do in the future.
That's actually really interesting. And that's actually the second topic I was going to or the second part of that I was going to bring up is that I feel like as far as aligning that base brain and the higher level brain, if you treat yourself, it's going to sound bad, but like a dog, like how would you train a dog to do something? You wouldn't tell the dog,
Right,
okay, now just do this because it's going to be good for you. You'd be like, hey, you did it. Here's a
right,
reward. And I find that to be very beneficial. Like I have my whole morning routine, and at the end I have breakfast, and it's a good breakfast, and I mean, it's healthy, but it tastes good.
right,
So it's that whole like, all right, good job. And I don't get that breakfast unless I complete my routine. So now it's like ingrained into my
right.
brain. The another topic I wanted to talk about, which sounds totally different from everything we've talked about, but it's in some ways very aligned, is creativity and how to improve
Right.
creativity. What kind of tips do you have for that?
Well, creativity is a little abstract. I put a lot of thought into just trying to figure out what a definition for creativity would be, and I came up with just problem solving in an elegant way.
Hmm.
And if you've set out to solve problems, doing that in an elegant way can certainly be achieved doing certain things that we've talked about, whatever nutritional supplements, smart drugs. But there's certain other activities that can help facilitate that process too. So, especially if you look at most creative people, they tend to achieve a lot of their sort of like flashes or inventions or their breakthrough moments in moments of either focus or isolation, or in a lot of cases, both. So they tend to think about whatever it is that they're working on, say it's some difficult engineering dilemma that they're trying to solve, right up until the moment that they sleep, which allows you to sort of subconsciously process all of the factors, all the parameters in your head. And a lot of times we tend to wake up with the solution just on our fingertips because over the night your brain has sort of like been humming and hashing out the information, figuring out the solution for you. Uh, Another thing that you can do, which I recommend, is learning lucid dreaming, which just means that whenever you fall asleep, a lot of people think that they don't dream. Well, we actually all do dream. We just have very varying levels of consciousness and control in those dreams. And there are certain things that you can do to basically become aware and in control of the events in your dream. So if you keep performing reality checks, like looking at your hands throughout the day, it'll also become a habit, kind of like we just talked about. And then you'll end up doing that in a dream and you'll realize, oh, I'm dreaming. And then if you learn to manage your emotional response inside a dream over time, then you can do different types of things in dreams. People that get really, really good at lucid dreaming, they can, sort of like command the events in the dream. They can recall things from their childhood that they couldn't recall when they were awake. And certain people can actually even work on their inventions while they're sleeping. And it's really, really advanced and sort of a little wacky too.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't know about that, but and I certainly don't have that level of proficiency yet. But it's something that certainly enhances creativity because it allows you to spend more hours on whatever it is that you're working and also examine things from like a different type of angle.
I'm curious if you've ever experimented with marijuana at all, because I have found, and there's been a lot of studies that does
Right,
improve creativity. I don't smoke weed currently. I have tried it I live in California, so I've tried it in the past,
right.
and I definitely find that after that, and I don't know if it's just the substance or the fact that when I do it, I tend to just kind of isolate myself, listen to music, and just really deeply relax. But have you ever experimented with that or found any research
Yeah,
on that?
well, uh, I've experimented. The I've had some, you sort of tend to examine things from a different type of perspective. I
Mhm.
usually tend to have some kind of, not really profound realization, but I kind of realize some really obvious thing that's in front of me.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, well, what is this? Or maybe this shouldn't be my life. I think the long-term use of that is definitely not good for you. It tends to make you very complacent, very lazy, even if people deny it.
I will be one of those people that every time, and I
Yeah,
was never, I never smoked like every day or anything like that. It'd be like,
right.
every once in a while. But I was always very much the opposite, that I'd almost get kind of anxious, like if I started being complacent. I'm like, for instance, the one time that always comes to mind to me is I was living with some friends and we didn't have any furniture and just months into it, and finally after that I was like, I could feel that anxiety of not having furniture. I'm like, we need to go get furniture and we need to do this. And
Yeah.
in other examples, it's I've been to the point where it's like, I hate my job, I need to quit it, I need to do this, this, and this. And it's like those things, those ideas that just float around my brain. I'm like, these are really bothering me, I need to do something about them. That's what I've
Yeah.
found.
It could, well, no, it can certainly trigger some kind of action if you do it, as you said, every once in a while. But if you look at sort of, you smoke 4 times a week, you smoke every day, it's
Yeah.
definitely just going to turn you into a typical pothead.
That's
You know,
that's probably, I don't know. That's probably true, at least from my
I
personal
find in
experience.
just looking at the people that I know that
Yeah,
doing it over long periods of time very often just doesn't have a very positive effect on that person.
yeah. As far as the lucid dreaming, kind of going back to that,
Right.
what have you done to help improve your ability to lucid dream?
Well, you can start off if you're sleeping. You wake up, if you have a little dream journal, and a lot of times if you wake up the first few minutes, you sort of remember glimpses or whatever pictures. You can write those down and it'll improve your recall over time. Same thing if you prepare over the day and you sort of repeatedly assure yourself, I will remember my dreams. It tends to improve your recall just by a little bit. And then once you have access to that little flash, that little like last moment right before you woke up, that allows you a lot of times to access whatever happened before that too. And performing the reality checks, I didn't really explain that, but if you look at your hands, throughout the day, you'll typically have 5 fingers on both hands. But then in a dream, a lot
Typically,
of times
not
you'll have six
every time.
fingers.
Really?
Well, right, and there's exceptions, but sometimes in a dream you'll have 6 fingers, you'll have 4 fingers. Same thing with watches. If you just keep looking at your watch, and if it's a digital one, sometimes in a dream the hours will display something quirky like 26 hours and 78 minutes, which makes no sense at all. So that's a thing that you can do as well. And then once you actually get into the dream and you start manipulating it, that's where like learning the emotional response is very, very important because you tend to freak out. You're like, oh my God, well, I'm in a dream now. and I can be Superman and fly around.
Hmm.
And another reality check that people are interested in this, you can jump up and down during the day. While you're awake, you'll come down very fast, but in a dream, you'll sometimes float.
That's interesting. It's funny. A buddy of mine is almost on the flip side. He would tell me that one thing he'd do during a normal day is ask himself, "Am I dreaming?" And it kind of
Right.
it focuses you, and it makes you kind of look around like, "Am I dreaming? Like, how do I know I'm not?" And then it makes you really kind of become part of reality because you have to look around and look at the details of the thing. Like, how do I know I'm not? But I
Right.
will say at one point I asked myself that in a dream, and I looked around and I decided, no, this is real life. So I always wonder, I don't know, there was just a weird bit of consciousness of like,
Right.
how do I know I'm not dreaming? That whole thing.
Because lucid dreaming is something that takes a long time. You don't learn it immediately. It can be very, very frustrating over long periods of time. But there's something called REST, which stands for, I believe, restricted environmental stimulation therapy, which is, there's like huge isolation tanks where you go in, the water is usually filled with Epsom salts. You get in, they close it, it's dark in there, you're in there for 45 minutes, you float in the water. It isolates all the sound and you don't see anything. And apparently that also allows you to sort of like think more clearly because you're not getting any of that extra stimulation from your environment.
Hmm.
And that's probably, in California, you can probably find a facility in your house that has one of those isolation tanks that you can try out.
Yeah, I've actually been, I don't know if you ever listened to the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, but he talks about
I've,
it
I've
all the
listened
time.
to a couple.
Yeah.
They're long though. I don't find I have the time to listen to all the. They're 3 hours long. The
Yeah, I break it up
episodes.
into like segments. On my phone, it kind of like will save my spot. And there's certain
Right.
people. Some episodes are pretty bad, but there's a lot of episodes that are really good. Like I don't care about the MMA fighters, but he has extremely intelligent people on there. But I've been to the one that he recommends all the time. It's $40 for 2 hours. It's really cheap. Other ones are like $70 for an hour. But is there ways that you can replicate that experience in your house without having to drive to an isolation tank? Like, have you done things to do that?
Well, you can do that to a certain extent. You can't obviously block out all stimulation because you'd have to hold up your ears and close your eyes. But what I just found, reading a lot of biographies of scientists, if you looked at Darwin, he wrote The Origin of Species on the Beagle. He was on a ship for 5 years just working on that one thing. Sort of Tesla used to be very reclusive in his life. So a lot of the brilliant scientists have been either, the stereotype of like an absent-minded scientist, but it's really the focused scientist who's sort of isolating himself from whatever is around him to focus on that one thing. If you can create that inside your own head, you don't really need to go necessarily to a certain environment. You can just be on the bus and the music can be blasting, but you'll still focus on the task at hand.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Anything else on creativity before we move on to the next topic?
No, I think that'll be it. I'll comment on because a lot of people think that, oh, LSD is like the path to creativity.
Sure.
I don't think the sort of one-off use is going to be bad for you long term, but I haven't seen really a lot of research that would say that it's safe long term.
Okay. Yeah, I did see some
Because
research on LSD.
right,
One time really being great for creativity. I think they took like 50 or so scientists, people that were like their life was just focused on this thing, and like out of it, like 46 of them ended up solving it like after
right.
one time with LSD. I have not tried LSD though myself. I would like to at some point, but not until I'm a little bit more. My what I always say is once I get $1 million, I'll do LSD because then who cares if I just quit everything and go hug trees for the rest of
Right,
my life.
right. Well, yeah, I'd be cautious about certain drugs because kind of like having written a book about smart drugs, you'd think I'd be, pushing pills, but really, I urge most people to proceed with caution and sort of very carefully look at the actions you're going to take and do your own homework. Just do your homework. That's the takeaway point here that I'd say is the one.
Will you try LSD or have you tried it?
I haven't. I think I would in the future,
Hmm.
definitely.
From what I've heard, it's like you need to be in the right place at your life and everything. And for the last couple of years, I don't think it would have been a good idea for me to take it. Like based on what people have told me, you should know yourself and know, hey, is this a good idea? And then, of course, the setting, etc. But I definitely think that's one of those things. Don't just like, yeah, whatever. Like Saturday night, I'm drunk with my friends. Like, why not? That's something to do.
Right, right.
So the next topic is speed reading, and this is something I hear a lot of people talk about. And obviously, books are just have a plethora of knowledge. So if you can consume them faster, that could potentially help you. But I know in some ways you're not a huge fan of speed reading. So can we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, speed reading is a technique basically that allows you to, I don't want to skim through text. I don't want to say skim through text, but in a certain way, it's just that, where you're either sort of guiding yourself to read a lot faster than you comfortably would, either with your finger or your pen, following the words, or you're sort of like looking with the periphery of your eyes and scanning the page. I think just having tried it, my retention of the material wasn't as good. But what I do say about speed reading or improving reading speed is that you can get a lot better at reading. I tend to read a lot, probably read about 3 or 4 hours a day. And one of the things that distinguishes people that are avid readers from people who don't read very often is that most people who read on a day-to-day basis tend to get rid of something called subvocalization. So for a lot of people, when they read, they tend to pronounce the words in their own head as if you were reading out loud, just not saying the words. The way I read is I just see the words and like there's no sound or sound going on in my head. And I tend to read, or I tend to remember whatever it is that I read very quickly or very well. And a lot of the research that I've looked at involves getting rid of subvocalization, which is a learned skill. And a lot of the research papers I've read get rid of subvocalization in a sort of like forced, coerced manner during the duration of one study. So they'll get a bunch of college kids and say, okay, you're going to read this fast now, and you're not going to vocalize the words. Well, and obviously in that case, you're probably going to lose a lot of comprehension. So a lot of people that are experts in reading speed or reading tend to say that if you get rid of subvocalization, your comprehension decreases. And that only is the case, at least I find, when you do that forcibly and you read a lot more or a lot faster than you comfortably would.
That's interesting. I'm going to have to, next time I read, I'm curious if I do that or not. I definitely might be doing that, which makes sense.
Well, and people do it to different extents. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not a really clear-cut line. One of the things, if you do it and you want to get rid of it over time, it'll correct itself over the years. If you read 2 hours a day, an hour a day, you'll sort of just get there over time. But one of the things that you can do to consciously get rid of subvocalization is focus on your breathing instead. So the way you read the words, you sort of like pace yourself differently than you're breathing. If you're breathing, you breathe calmly. Just focus on that, and then like the words won't even pronounce themselves in your own mind.
It's really interesting. That's definitely something I'm going to try. So that's about the last question I had, but is there any other big tips that you have for increasing your daily brain performance?
Well, I just say that addressing the fundamentals is certainly the most important thing that you can do. Also, just do your homework. I think I got some feedback from some readers saying that, oh, your book didn't really provide clear-cut answers in the sense that like you should do this, this, and this, and this. It's more like you try to figure out what it is, or if you want to improve your intelligence, you would figure out what facet of intelligence you want to improve, say memory. Then you take a certain action that could benefit that. And then if that doesn't work, you try taking some other kind of action. And then once your memory is improved to like the level that you want to improve it to, you would figure out another goal for yourself where you work on your attention span or whatever. But it's really a long process, and there's like a learning curve to it. It's not as simple as going to the doctor and complaining of symptoms that you don't really have and then getting some magic pills that are going to mess you up long term.
Awesome. A great advice. This has been a great episode. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. And if you did, make sure you hit the big red subscribe button down below. You can also check me out on Facebook and on Twitter. And I release a new video every Monday. And by hitting that subscribe button, you'll get those new videos every Monday. And this is really a podcast. It's also a website. You can check out the website. It's howtodoyour20s.com. I'll put a link right over here as well. And what it's all about is trying to improve your life. And we specifically focus on things that people in their 20s are interested in. So make sure you like the video if you liked it. Subscribe. Like us on Facebook and Twitter, whatever. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you again on another video.